Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Bob. Oh, pardon me. Camera have the shade still partly over it. This is Bob back again. Today we're going to be talking about the progressive era. Um, Last week we introduced the socialist and anarchist movements, which were emerging up out of the um, kind of social ferment created by the conditions of industrial capitalism. Truly horrifying conditions that we had talked about in the prior unit. The reaction by working class people was, in many ways, or in many places rather, to assemble together to either at the point of work um, and to begin to agitate for their particular rights within those workspaces through striking, through work stoppages, and strikes took a number of different modes depending on the conditions and strategic decisions of the people who are organizing them. Sometimes they would be walkout strikes where you're literally on a picket line that most of us may be more familiar with today. Some of them were sit-down strikes, where people would go into work and then they would just simply sit at their workstation and not do the required activities, right? They would literally stop the machinery from moving at that point. There were strikes that involved operating the machinery of capital, but taking ownership of the property itself and selling it for the benefit, the common benefit of the workers in that space. Um, the other thread was to band together to actually bring violence to those who had brought violence to workers, right? And that a lot of that is coming more out of the anarchist movement, right? The more radical left anarchist movement. And their activities, again, built out of that from that space of work, but those activities being more confrontational um, on a personal level with the capitalists that were assaulting, exploiting them. Um, there's often like hard lines that are drawn by historians between these two movements, and I feel like I might be a little bit guilty of that as well. Human beings love categories and we get really affixed to them. But what you have to understand is that the differentiation between socialists and anarchists is a fuzzy and movable line. Um, there are many people involved in the movement who would have considered themselves to be socialists that historians would later describe as anarchists. Many of the people that were involved in the Haymarket Affair, for example, there are people that were involved in the movement that would have considered themselves to be anarchists in their beliefs, and historians call them socialists, right? So really what we're talking about instead of hard categories is tendencies, right? But these are both working class movements. They're both originating up from the point of labor, up from that class of laboring people and responding directly to the conditions that are affecting them. What we're going to talk about today is the progressive movement. And the progressive movement comes from a very different place. And the readings that I'm going to introduce to you today are going to talk about a number of elements in the progressive movement that are important to think about. First and foremost, I want you guys to note that the progressive movement is not a working class movement. It is not being driven by working class people. It is not seeking to address working class concerns by and large. It is not being informed by working class people. Um, the progressive movement is a middle class movement, and it finds its roots going all the way back to the reform movements of the early 19th century, the abolitionist movement, which began for white people in the 1820s and 1830s, the temperance movement, which began in the 1830s and 40s, the women's suffrage movement, which started to pick up steam really in the 1840s after the Niagara Conference, um, the the prison reform movement and insane asylum reform movements that emerged both in the 1830s and 1840s. These early 19th century, mid 19th century reform movements were also driven primarily by middle-class people, right? Now, the abolitionist movement is a little bit more complicated because you have kind of white abolitionist, you have white abolitionist organizations and you have black abolitionist organizations. And I'm making a distinction between the two. White abolitionists tended to be middle class. They tended to be highly religious. They tended to be motivated by a sense of social welfare, of a kind of noblesse oblige, right? They were driven by a moral umbrage. The black abolitionist movement, very different, working class, driven by that, a real like commitment from a fundamental level to the ending of slavery. So just want to make that clear. So the progressive era that emerges in the 1890s is really, you see its roots, sometimes directly within families, going back to the reform movements of the 1830s and 1840s. So like a lot of progressive activists could look back on their family and say, yeah, my father was an abolitionist, and before him, my mother had been his grandmother had been a temperance activist in the 1840s, right? So you have this kind of daisy chain of inheritance. And so the intellectual basis for the progressive movement is middle class. What do I mean by middle class? This is primarily the professional managerial class of people that have begun to emerge within capitalism as servants of capitalism. Okay, so any business that gets started, once it gets larger than a family concern, requires capitalists to bring in managers and experts in order to facilitate the production of profit. So you have the owner or owners of a business, of a concern. And underneath that, you have a whole bevy of professional experts and managers who are hired on to help them facilitate the work, to make the work happen and to happen efficiently, okay? And to protect the interests of those owners. So the professional managerial class is everything from people who are, managing the workflow within the factories, your foremen, your shift bosses, your payroll and bookkeeping and accounting experts. You also have your, the people that are managing the legal end of the business, lawyers and paralegals and clerks. You have people that are managing inventory. You have inventory clerks. You have people that are managing the gathering of other smaller businesses and the absorption of smaller or vulnerable businesses into this concern so that it can grow. Those are known as mergers and acquisitions specialists. You have people that are specialists in the marketing of products, right? The marketing executives. And so every owner has to, as the business grows and gets larger, employ an increasingly large professional managerial class who are these specialists and experts who facilitate the production of profit. And so these very essential servants of the capital class, the bourgeois class at the top, are often called the petit bourgeois, right? The little middle class, the little rich, right? Because whereas they have often, they don't have the same kind of ownership stake, the same kind of claim on the value being produced as the owners, they certainly have more of a claim than the workers on the floor who are actually producing the product. They are remunerated more than the average worker, and sometimes exceedingly more. One could transition from the professional managerial class to the ownership class, from the petit bourgeois to the bourgeois. If one, saved money, sent your kids to good colleges, got them into the networking of the capital class, and, enabled them to become wealthy enough and have enough access to those networks to be able to become a member of the bourgeoisie. And so if we look at the kind of values that are becoming, that are emerging during the late 19th century, the kinds of the values that are being extorted in popular culture, those are the values that are being privileged in the public media, right? One of the most famous books that was written during the late 19th century was a book known as Horatio Algiers. And it's become a kind of a joke. The Horatio Algiers mythology, right, came out of this individual, this author named Horatio Algiers, who used to write these kind of young adult novels. And there were all these stories about impoverished boys who would, like, through their ambition and their intelligence and their hard work, would rise from their poverty to wealthy status, right? And so these Horatio Algiers stories, which, this is like a genre named after this man, they were intended for children, and they were intended to be instructive to children about how they should move through the world. And these are firmly middle-class values that are based on the middle-class experience. Because if you were born into a family of lawyers and you had the kind of material privileges that allowed you to have a good education, and you had that ability to potentially, acquire social mobility through that privilege, then the Horatio Algiers myth has a lot of saliency for you, right? And there are a lot of stories of middle-class people, of the petit bourgeois, who were able to become socially mobile as the American economy is expanding. And so a lot of what is informing the progressive movement is coming out of that increasingly large, increasingly powerful, politically powerful class of people. And I would argue has continued to inform American politics, especially what we would consider today to be liberal American politics up until the present day. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But so when we look at the progressive movement and we're thinking about, like, what are the elements of the progressive movement, one of the most important elements is the idea of public institutions being in and of themselves crucially important for the maintenance of public order. Okay, this is really important. So the police that had been created in the 1830s, beginning in Boston and New York, were wildly corrupt institutions almost from the jump. And for a long time, the people in power really didn't care very much that they were corrupt. These institutions were not designed to be public service institutions. They were designed to be muscle for the bosses. So when workers went out on strike, they could beat the hell out of them. They were designed to be an institution that disciplined the working class into, quote, knowing their place. And when they stepped out of line, they were essentially beaten, or they were killed, or they were imprisoned, right? And so police institutions were not crime-fighting institutions, or they were crime-fighting institutions only in as much as that criminality threatened property, right? They weren't investigatory. They didn't have, like, detective bureaus and people with, magnifying lenses looking at evidence and clues. And, they walked around the streets, and if you acted out of line, they beat the shit out of you with pardon me, I apologize. They would beat the snot out of you with a billy club. So the corruption of the police was endemic from the very beginning. And what do we mean by corruption? Well, basically, if you were operating an illegal, saloon, or operating an illegal brothel, or operating an illegal gambling house, you would pay off the cops on the local beat and they would look the other way. And if somebody higher up the food chain got involved, you would pay them off too. And so the public and pretty brazen corruption of these institutions, it began to spread throughout American politics. And as more and more entrepreneurial, let's say, criminal elements began to emerge in American cities, you began to see the building of political machines that were built around facilitating working class needs and utilizing kind of gaps in the enforcement of the law to get done what needed to get done. The most famous of these institutions was an institution known as Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was this political machine that utilized a top-down hierarchical structure of officers who were in New York City that were each responsible for different geographic areas. And below them, they would have a coterie of people that were responsible for smaller precincts. And their job was to get out the vote. And so they basically hand selected and utilized this machine hierarchy and structure to get politicians elected and to basically force them to adopt whatever public policies that serve their interests. Now, what did voters get in return? Well, these political machines were empowering, right? Like a precinct isn't simply going to go along with the local boss. The precinct, the people in that precinct are going to demand certain things of that boss. And Tammany Hall was responsible for making sure that those things got delivered. Otherwise, you would lose the loyalty of that precinct and they would start voting another way. So this is a negotiated situation and a negotiated relationship that if you look back in ancient Rome, it was actually the patronage. It looks like the patronage system. That's how senators got elected in ancient Rome. It's the same relationship. So the progressives were very upset by this because they had this belief that, well, we are the best people because we have all of this privilege as opposed to these other people who don't. So it must mean that we're wiser or we have some kind of quality that stands us out from other people in the country. And so if those people are able to have this transactional relationship with government, those poor people, those working people are able to have this transactional relationship with government, that somehow is corrupting the essential, like, ethereal good that government should instill, which is government should be dispassionate, disinterested, meaning not particularly serving one class or another, or one interest or another. It should find the best policies, quote unquote, the best policies, and institute them. And what's getting in the way of that is this corrupt relationship between these political machines and the working class voters that are supporting them. And so one of the major efforts in the late 19th century is, beginning almost immediately after the Civil War, is this effort to reform American government so that it will no longer be corrupt, right? And so what emerges out of this is the anti-political corruption movement. And so this is where we get, for example, the civil service exam. If any of you ever want to be a postal worker or want to be a police officer or a firefighter or any other civil servants, you have to take a civil service exam, right? And that exam exists because of this movement. It was a reform measure because the people who used to run the police, the fire, the public works, who used to be in the mail service, those are people who were political appointees. They were people who were appointed to those offices because they had performed well in getting out the vote for the political machine of whatever region you're talking about, right? So these middle class values of hard work and nose to the grindstone. Everybody, has a place, and everybody has equal opportunity, and everybody rises to the level of their own competence. That fantasy is really driving a lot of these, a lot of the underlying ideology. That is what is driving the underlying kind of ideology of these policies. People get obsessed as a result with the idea of racial categorization in terms of intelligence. This is known as the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement takes off in a big way during this period, which was an attempt to make prior racial designations scientifically categorized, right? And you have the emergence of this ideal called social Darwinism. These would be good things to be writing down, right? So, the kind of larger ideologies of progressivism, that people kind of rise to the level of that they are supposed to be at, and that the social conditions that people exist within, that's where their natural proclivity, their natural talent level has set them. Therefore, people who are successful, they're better people, right? And if you're looking at races of people who have more money or more social mobility or more access to wealth than other groups of people, then those races of people must likewise be better, right? And so it's the codifying and it's the attempt to make scientific the material reality in which these people live. And so social Darwinism and the eugenics movement that emerges out of that are these attempts to codify this. And so I want to show you a couple of pictures. And these emerged out of actually the US university system. UC Davis was one of the first places that was doing work on eugenics. There are some startling images that kind of emerge when one is looking at some of the material that was created during this period in the 1890s. People became obsessed with skull shape. The shape of someone's skull was a kind of indicator of one's intelligence level, or one's proclivity for violence, for example, right? I'm going to show something, and I want to warn you that like the level of racism that you're about to witness is truly astounding. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen. So this is an illustration that was part of a study to look at the physical and mental characteristics of a family unit as it went through generation. And the argument that's being made in this pseudoscientific article is the idea of racial characteristics muddying the blood or tainting the genetic code of families. So if you had an ancestor that was of one of the lesser, quote unquote, lesser races, that taint would follow through the family line. And they start to say, okay, the type. And when they talk about type, they're talking about the skull shape, right? They're the type of face, right? The type of structure, right? And they have, a black circle for Indian, half black, half white for suggestion of Indian, white circle for European or Danish, eyes dark, gray, hazel, blue, hair dark, red, medium brown, blonde or red blonde, right? And they start with this first generation who has a Indian shaped skull, right? Quote unquote. Dark eyes and dark hair. And then that one of the daughters marries a European, right? And their children have these characteristics that emerge, right? You have two daughters, one of whom marries a man and has two children, right? And the idea is that these racial characteristics flowing through this generation are also indicative of the mental characteristics that are flowing through this family, right? And so the supposed intellectual deficits that were inherent in this racial category of Indian are following this family through, right? An inheritance chart, I'll read, that traces back to the Carib Indian woman 5 generations ago. Note that the Indian characteristics tend to have as a unit and that the non-Indian individuals do not transmit Indian characteristics. This is an example of Mendelizing characteristics in man. Few others are colorblindness and forms of insanity, feeble-mindedness, dwarfism, albinism, which is when you don't have any skin tone, baldness, absence of teeth, deaf mutism, and musical ability. That's one of my favorites. Apparently, if you had musical ability, it meant you had some kind of like moral or intellectual deficiency. Middle class, the upper middle class are psychotic. So when you're looking at this, these kinds of categories, this is emerging. Like these are people who exist in a nightmare, and they are relatively privileged within that nightmare. And so they have to explain why they get to live slightly above the horror that they can see roiling right underneath their feet. They don't have the kind of detachment and distance that the capitalists do, right? The super wealthy, they're buying homes out in Newport, Rhode Island. They're buying homes out in, Palo Alto, California. Like they're living away from the poors. The only poor people they interact with are poor people that work for them in their homes as domestic servants, right? Or, people who are working out in their gardens. They don't deal with masses of impoverished people. The middle class does, because that's part of their job. Their job is they have to be on the coalface managing those people and getting them to make to produce as much as possible. So they're interacting with poor people, and so they can see the poverty, they can witness the poverty, and sometimes they can actually feel, not to the same degree as the working poor, but they can sometimes feel the negative consequences of that poverty in the lives that they lead, right? And so they have to explain to themselves why they get to be above that fray, why they don't have to starve, why they don't have to die of horrifying malnutrition-related diseases, why they don't have to listen to their babies scream and cry themselves to death because the milk being produced by their mothers is not caloric enough to allow them to survive. They have to explain that to themselves. Okay. And the way that they do it is through these reform movements, which are all inevitably directed at the working class as being the deficient class. You want to make sense out of workers' poverty, but have no responsibility for it yourself. The narrative is they're poor because it's their fault. They're in jail because it's their fault. They haven't been socially mobile because it's their fault. And that requires an enormous amount of effort to sustain because it's a lie. It's a fantasy. And so whenever you're lying, and you guys, I'm sure, have all done this at one point in your life or another, when you're lying, you got to do a lot more work than when you're being honest. And so the amount of effort that goes into these reformist movements to try to create this narrative of poverty being the fault of the impoverished is extensive. This has tendrils that will reach out into the future in some very horrifying ways. If you are looking for the origin point of Nazism, this is it. The combination of the American creation of the American Lebensraum in the West, the conquest and incorporation of the West into a capitalized agricultural zone that flooded the eastern cities with food and allowed this economic engine to explode with growth from the 1840s to really until, honestly, until like 10 years ago. And this emerging ideology coming up out of the middle and upper middle classes, this petit bourgeois, that essentially says, oh, we deserve to be here because we're white and we're smart and we work hard. And the people that aren't here, it's because they're somehow racially or inherently deficient. That becomes the building blocks, the material and ideological building blocks for the Nazi project. Built the German Lebensraum in the East by getting rid of these subhuman people that, in the German case, were the Slavs. So when you're reading the progressive movement, understand that these are not people who are seeking to help others. These are people that are seeking to make sense out of their own privilege within a nightmare. Okay. I hope you get a lot out of the reading. I'm posting up another video tomorrow to dig into some of the specifics. So I will let you go. You can get some of that reading done, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Hope you're all well. See ya.